we go. Oh!
Off the boat, back in Tokyo. Welcome back, Timothy. And it's nice to see you. You have a very nice suntan. Great to see that too.
Yes, the first layer has already peeled off.
Oh, that was quick. Okay, great. So we don't have to actually talk too much for the intro today, I believe. But yeah, there are quite a few things that have been happening during this week. PM Kishida has been traveling a lot, doing a lot of, well, diplomacy and so on. A lot of other things happening as well. So let's dive directly into this.
Great.
And yes.
Let's get right into it, Maya. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Today is May 7th, 2023. Today, Maya, is episode 117. Congratulations for, God damn it, every Sunday morning at 8:20 doing this briefing with you. So thank you very much.
Yes, yes. Thank you.
So we are at the end of Golden Week. 7 days, for some people, maybe 10 days of consecutive vacations, stringing together several national holidays and several companies giving off just an extra day off, or, employees taking the voluntary day off to string this together. It is one of the only 3 times that Japan actually goes on a vacation. Many people, of foreign observers, didn't even know that Japanese took vacations, but they do. Golden Week is one, Obon is the other, and then Oshogatsu is the third one. But in between those brief spans, yes, the Japanese are known to be very fastidious workers and showing up for work and getting the job done. So it's one of the characteristics of living and working in Japan that I think everybody knows about. I'd like to get into the news reports today. It has been Golden Week, and as Maya said, the Prime Minister has been traveling. Politically, there hasn't been a lot going on because not only are the banks generally on vacation, but the Diet is not in session as well. There are some bills that are moving through the Diet process. LGBTQ is somewhat stalled. There's also movement on the new refugee status legislation. It looks like that will be passed through. And then for those of you who are following, you might have heard that the Ministry of Justice has scrapped the foreign internship program. It received a lot of bad press. It's been in process for about 12 years, where workers from a lot of the Southeast Asian countries, Vietnam, Thailand, all over Southeast Asia, apply for the program. They work something out with their government. They get visas to come here, and they are distributed throughout various industries and manufacturers throughout Japan for a training session, generally lasting 3 years. But it has received a lot of bad press. A lot of YouTube videos have come up of these foreign workers being abused and mistreated, their passports being secured away from them, sometimes getting pregnant and having problems with that sort of thing. So they've taken that, they've pushed it away, and now they're coming up with another program, hopefully to infuse more workers to come here, to get them acclimated to Japan. Generally speaking, takes a couple of years, learn a little bit of the language, and then they can apply for a worker visa after that period. So that's gone through quite a bit of legislation. It looks like it will be passed before the G7. By the way, G7 is what? It's 12 days away. So this is a big deal for Japan. It's a big deal for the Prime Minister. G7 will be the highlight, the pinnacle of the Prime Minister's term in office so far. He has been building up for it. A lot of money and effort has been spent on it. They have had ministerial meetings in Gunma, in Karuizawa, in Sapporo. The one in Gunma just this last week was for the digital policy ministerial. So Konotaro, the minister of the digital agency, was leading that one. They came up with a couple of recommendations. And so these ministerials are actually providing to the G7 leaders the recommendations that they will sign off on in the 3 days from the 19th, the 20th, and the 21st in Hiroshima. So that's big on the calendar. Previous to that was the election that we just got through. I'll give you a little bit of an update on that. Ishin is still coming up strong. And so the prime minister, as we've been discussing on the show, I guess more intensively over the last 2 months, is will the prime minister call for an election? He has within his ability as prime minister to close down the lower house and have a snap election. It generally takes maybe 5 days of internal processing. Usually you get a bit of a sniff of that in that 5-day period, and then he calls it. And when he calls it, it is something of a surprise. The newspapers report on it, and they give a little bit of a time for the members to be prepared for the election campaign. And then it's a 15-day, 14-day election cycle. No, it's 10 days for the lower house, an election cycle where they go campaigning to regain their seats or for new contenders to come up as candidates for the open seats. All of the seats in the lower house come open, and the theory practiced by the prime minister is he wants to end up with more seats within his political party than he ended with when he closed down the Diet. So this gradual coming up of his appreciation among the general population, his popularity, the people who ascribe to his theories on how to manage the government, the inflation rate, how he's dealing with the new Bank of Japan governor Ueda. All of these things kind of go into a calculation, and there is a little bit of recent data on this that would suggest maybe it's an option for him. We already know that G7 will be a big success in Hiroshima. It is the prime minister's home turf. It is where he was elected. It's where he basically grew up. His parents were there. And that's where his son is being prepared for his political future. So he's very strong in Hiroshima, and this will be a really dynamic and effective summit. All people agree to that. Joe Biden will come in. He'll be the first, well, he won't be the first president to visit Hiroshima. Barack Obama did that. And he did that with former Prime Minister Abe. That was a huge success. They were hoping that the president of the United States would also visit Nagasaki in a 1-2 kind of visit, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen. The prime minister has also extended the invitation to South Korea President Yoon, which is a big deal. And the prime minister will be visiting South Korea today, or he is in South Korea today and tomorrow. This is the first time for the prime minister to visit South Korea since, when was it? Maybe 2019 or so. It's really the culmination of a lot of effort being devoted by the United States and Japan and South Korea to kind of mend these wounds, mend this relationship, because the relationship between South Korea and Japan is so critical to this overarching desire by the United States to have this coalition of like-minded countries in the face of what's going on in China vis-a-vis Taiwan, and also with regard to North Korea. So not much news to report on North Korea, but I suspect in the next 12 days or so, we will be hearing something from our dear leader. The kind of timing is set there with all the G7 leaders in Hiroshima for him to take his shoe off and slam it down on the podium to remind people that I am here. So be on notice for something like that coming up too. So in the grander scheme of things, Japan is slipping in its attempt to win friends and influence countries on the African continent. The prime minister just came back on Friday from a 5-nation visit. He visited Singapore, he visited Ghana, where else was he? Mozambique, Kenya, and Egypt. And Africa has pretty much been um, I don't know, not ignored, but we talked about it sometime somewhat last week on the amount of foreign direct investment being devoted to Africa by Japan. That's typically how Japan plays diplomacy, is by spending money and working on infrastructure projects. But China has been in Africa very, very aggressively over the last 8 years, building a lot of things. And so there's something of a this uh, um, anvil held over the head of these countries who are accepting a lot of money, getting a lot of infrastructure projects um, uh, done in their countries, and the Chinese extracting some sort of leverage as a consequence of that, and they've made great inroads there. And so uh, the like-minded countries, that means the United States, Australia, Canada, Japan in particular, are being encouraged to kind of redevelop those relationships. Japan is on the back heels of that, but that explains why the prime minister was in Egypt and Ghana, Mozambique, Kenya this last week, and talking about spending more money in these countries. He was in Ghana. He made a promise of 500 million US dollars. Of course, it's in Japanese yen, but 500 million US dollars in infrastructure projects, and visiting Mozambique. Mozambique, it might be a head scratcher to a lot of people, but you probably don't know that during the period when the country was being unified under the shogunate, there was a black samurai who, it is said, emanated or immigrated from Mozambique. It's a great story, a fabulous story. I think Deborah DeSnow is doing or thinking of doing a movie on that, or a documentary on that. Deborah is frequently a listener on this show, so maybe she can chime in. I know she's really on a roll these days. But Mozambique is important. Ghana, Egypt, of course. He was in Egypt just the other day and returned to Japan then. In a separate kind of sad piece of news, there was if you've ever been around downtown Tokyo, you've got the Diet Complex, where you have the House of Parliament, and behind that you have the three Diet members' office building, and then you have the prime minister's residence, and there are security guards just about everywhere there. And as the prime minister came back to Japan about 5:30 in the morning, there was one of the security police, the Diet police, who unfortunately committed suicide in the bathroom next to or attached to the prime minister's residence. So not a lot of details going on there. That just happened on Friday morning. We're still kind of looking at that, but it is always a sad thing. And suicide is always a problem here in Japan. It's the number of suicides in this country is abnormally high, and there's a lot of effort going on to figure that out and also to address it. But I digress. The refugee bill, as I talked about, is moving forward, and this is tightening down. Now, you might remember the young lady who was ill in detention. She was here on a short-term visa. Her visa lapsed. She was kept in detention. She got ill in detention, and they kind of allowed her to die while she was in detention. So it received a lot of criticism there. Not really was anybody punished as a consequence of that, but it has received a lot of press attention, and the Diet has decided that they need to revise the rules on how to handle the refugee status. So typically, if you are seeking refugee status, or you want to stay in Japan, you've overstayed your visa, and you have some fear, some viable fear of persecution or threat to your physical body. If you go back to your home country, you need to convince the authorities here, and it can be denied once, twice, 3 times. And so the new law is designed to actually cut it off and actually send these applicants back to their home country after the 3rd try. So there's a lot of gamesmanship between the LDP, Komeito, the Constitutional Democratic Party, Ishin, and these it's maybe too complicated to go into in this briefing, but the way the different parties lobby and refine the bill to suit their own constituents' needs is a real testament to how democracy and how politics works in this country. Maybe if there's enough interest in it, we can go into it in the Q&A session after we finish this briefing. The other thing that the prime minister has really set a high mark on is he wants to have more Japanese students visiting overseas, studying abroad. He's actually said he wants 500,000, 500,000 Japanese students to go abroad to study in some form or another within the next couple of years. And this is I think it's really good. I mean, most of the people here on our briefing have come to Japan as a component of an exchange student, maybe as a JET or a Monbusho scholar or something like that. And so it is a very effective way of blending the two countries and the two cultures. And the people, I mean, I came in on a Monbusho scholarship as well 35, 40 years ago. And it does help develop and enrich that relationship. So I think it's a good strategy. But what the numbers look like here is he wants 500,000 Japanese kids to be going abroad, not just to the United States or Australia, all over the world, study abroad, and then come back or maybe even stay in their host countries. And he wants 400,000 of the foreign students to come to Japan. This is a bit of a hurdle I think most people would understand. Going abroad to study in a university anywhere in the world is a lot nicer, it's easier, it's better than a foreign student coming in and trying to do the same thing here. The infrastructure is different, the lifestyle is different, the activities that are conducted by student organizations, it's vastly different. The level of study, the determination of the university students and that sort of thing, it's just a very different ball of wax. But 400,000 is a big number. What did it look like before? Well, in let's see, in 2021, let me see. Let me back up a little bit. So of the 500,000 that he wants studying abroad, he wants 150,000 of them to be in the foreign countries on degree programs. So they will go, they will apply. 150,000 of the 500,000 he wants dedicated to earning a degree in a foreign university. 230,000 of them, he wants them to be short-term stays, for example, a year abroad, studying abroad, or maybe on a semester exchange program, that sort of thing. And 110,000 of these, he wants to be high school students who go to homestays and that sort of thing. So it's somewhat really well figured out by the Prime Minister's office. What it looked like just 2 years ago, there were 62,000 Japanese students who studied abroad in degree programs. He wants to take that 62,000 to 150,000. For the short-term students, for university students for a year abroad or a semester or something like that, 2 years ago it was 113,000. He wants to kick that up to 230,000 students. And for the high school, 2 years ago it was 43,000 Japanese high schoolers went to foreign countries on some sort of a program, short-term program. He wants to take that 43,000 students to 110,000, almost a almost a threefold increase. So this is very aggressive. He wants to do this by, have this all achieved by 2033. So it's a very aggressive design, but he's putting a lot of effort into that and a lot of money. The Justice Minister has also decided to scrape the foreign internship program, as I talked about just very briefly earlier. So this policy designed and administered by the Justice Ministry has generated a lot of controversy, has kind of brought the numbers down of people's respect and admiration for the bureaucracy on doing their job. And so they've taken that to heart and they've revised that. They've actually scrapped it, and they're putting together a new rule and a new program of actually enticing more people to come in, giving them more options. If they come here, they can change their visa midterm. If they get pregnant, they can have options for staying here. They can get married here. So the restrictions that really stymied the earlier program and really painted Japan as a very negative place to work because of the work conditions and the discrimination between, I mean, there's discrimination everywhere in Japan between the seishain and the part-time workers, between the foreigners and the Japanese, between just all sorts of things, as almost in every country you experience that. But the distinction between the foreign interns and regular Japanese was just too stark. So they're addressing that one as well. Just for an election update, you might remember 2 weeks ago we had an election, the two-phase election for 9 governors in phase 1 and several mayors of rather large cities. That was phase 1. And phase 2 had 2 components. It was municipalities, more than 2,000 election seats for different municipalities, and 5 diet seats. Of those 5 diet seats, 4 were in the lower house, 1 was in the upper house. The LDP got 4, but they lost 1 to Ishin. And so that is one of the things that is propelling Ishin. Ishin did extremely well in this last election cycle. But after a week of being able to analyze it, it looks like the women as candidates for these posts is inching up. It's not hugely dramatic, but the women are beginning to run more for office and be elected more for office. One of the hot button issues in any campaign these days is childcare and how a working mother can have 1 child or 1.2 children, or the prime minister wants 3 children, or please have babies. It's a difficult goal for him to achieve without more support, without higher income, without greater acclamation for mothers who have children. A lot of mothers with children are basically single mothers. So he's in this last election in 2021, 80% of the men, 80% of men occupied positions in councils and assemblies throughout Japan. In the parliament, 85% of the men hold seats in the upper house and in the lower house. And in the municipalities, this election that we just finished, it was a little bit more than 2,000 seats, but it was only about 40% of the vast number of seats in Japan. So they hold these elections every 3 years. So this was a nationwide election, but it didn't include everybody. It's kind of on a staggered basis. But in that area, 84%, a little bit less than the national average, were occupied by men. So the women are beginning to run more, and they're beginning to get more elections. So the real thing, and not just for the municipal elections or how women are being treated or what the prime minister is doing, is should the prime minister call a snap election in the near term, like within the next 2 or 3 months, we will be able to see very clearly this pace of women running for elections and being elected. And I suspect that there will be more dramatic increases coming up. The G7 ministerial was in Gunma. Gunma, actually, a classmate of mine from Georgetown, is actually the governor of Gunma, Ichita Yamamoto, and another classmate, Taro Kono, from Georgetown, is the digital minister. So those 2 guys, I'm sure they didn't invite me to come up and have beers with them, but the G7 ministerial on digital and technology policy was in Gunma. They concluded on Friday, and so all of the bigwigs in digital policy for the G7 were there to decide what their recommendation is going to be to the G7 leaders, and they will sign off on it on the 19th, the 20th, or the 21st. It'll be a big deal. And one of the big issues here is the issue of data free flow with trust, which means for a country, for example, in Japan, Microsoft sets up a company here and they do internet services. For some countries, they don't want that data that is generated, the big data or user information, to be to escape their country. So Vietnam is like that. China is like that. If Yahoo sets up a company in China, they are restricted from exporting that country for analysis or for number crunching for big data purposes from the host country. So Japan is, and the United States is of the mind that they want this data to be free flowing. Many people have said that the oil of this century moving forward is not oil, it's not the energy component, but it is data. And so people need to be able to freely exchange data and use that data. And it's under the rubric of the free flow of data with trust. So Japan is a proponent of that, so that the sources of data flow are open, but they have certain security enhancements to it. So that will be decided in G7. I don't know if they've got a home run out of it. The EU nations are generally more liberal with that. The other countries are less liberal. They want to control it and restrict it. So we will see as G7 comes along. But that was a big one. So there was in Sapporo, there was the green transformation ministerial maybe 2 weeks ago. Then there was Karuizawa with the foreign ministers. And just this last week was the digital ones. There are about 27 ministerials that have occurred. They're still occurring now to provide these recommendations, and they'll all be signed off. And then there'll be a lot of reports, a lot of news tumbling out of Hiroshima on what the countries decided. So you're just getting a bit of a sense of that right now. So we'll see. We'll keep an eye on that. The Bank of Japan Governor Uedo Kazuo had his first policy meeting with his team. He was just appointed by the Prime Minister. He took office on the earlier this month, I think on the 5th or 8th of this month. And so he had his first policy meeting. People are watching that. They're watching, does he scratch his nose? Is he twitching his fingers? Is he twirling his pen as he's going through these? Everything means something, and they've been watching him very closely. Nothing was let out of the bag. He didn't really indicate too much of a change in policy from what his predecessor was doing. But clearly, the drive to keep inflation at 2% in Japan hasn't worked, and he's got to do something about that. So what he has said is that he's going to be standing pat on the dovish policy with monetary policy and the yield controls on the bonds that are issued. But Japan, the Bank of Japan, is going to continue to purchase willy-nilly these bonds that are issued to kind of support the yen. It is not a good long-term policy. He has acknowledged that. And so he has said that he is going to initiate a comprehensive review that's going to take between 12 and 18 months. So whenever, if you're doing a job and somebody walks in and says, I want to do a review of what you're doing, you're always worried about, is your job secure? Are you being reprimanded for something? People are digging into your work process and your how you're doing your job. So this is something of some concern without letting too much out. But it looks like he will maintain the 2% inflation rate. But he has also said that in pursuing the 2%, it requires an increase in the wages. So the wages have been stagnant for almost 2 decades. We've been talking about that. It's a main bone of contention. And he has said that if we're going to maintain that, we do need to increase wages. And on a different piece of news, price increases have continued to go up. So the governor of the Bank of Japan is working on several different fronts, just like the prime minister is working on several different fronts. But just this year, there have been 20,000 food and beverage items, just food and beverage. There are other increases that have gone on throughout the economy, but 20,000 food and beverage items have gotten a price increase since the beginning of this year, according to Teikoku Data Bank. It's going to go over 30,000 before the beginning of the summer, so just in the next few months. And this pace really increased, didn't increase so much January, February, March, but April, being as April is the start of the fiscal year, a lot of things happened there. So in April, there were 5,000 increases. In May, there were 820 increases. And in June, there were 3,300 increases. So it is ramping up. It did start in January, February, March, but the numbers are beginning to increase. And so that still leaves, since April, it's only been 9,500 items, food and beverage items. And now from April until the beginning of summer, it's going to go to 30,000. So the price increases you'll notice in a lot of different products, but in particular, mayonnaise. I know Evan loves mayonnaise, and too bad for you, but you're going to see price increases there because of the avian flu that has kind of established itself here in Japan. It's all over Thailand and Southeast Asia, and it has come to Japan. So the price of eggs is going to increase as a national as a natural consequence, but it's just prices are increasing exponentially as a consequence of what's going on in Ukraine, the cost of fuel and the restrictions placed on trading with Russia. All of these things have come up, and so the Bank of Japan governor really has his work cut out for him. Let me see. Population, as we reported maybe 2 weeks ago, the population of Japan has now decreased under 125 million people. So this was predicted. You can see the demographics that predict that. It was, let me see, the peak of the Japanese population was in 2008. And that population was 128 million. So not so vastly different from 125 million that we've had until just recently. But now the decline will be a little bit more precipitous. So it is predicted that this number, 125 million, will go to 87 million, down 70%, or 70% of what it is right now in the year 2070, so in 50 years. And interestingly, although the number of Japanese is decreasing, it does mean that the populations of other countries who are contributing and participating in the Japanese economy, even if it stays flat, will increase. But even in light of that, there are more foreigners coming in, as I said, with the foreign internship training program, and also the number of students that the Prime Minister wants to come to Japan, 400,000 a year. He wants to initiate that quickly, and also the Japanese who will be traveling overseas to study in other countries. So it looks like right now the number of foreign participants in the Japanese economy is about 2.2%. And that number is somewhat cryptic because there are a lot of non-Japanese who live in Japan, who have lived in Japan for a long time, the naturalized Koreans, for example, a lot of Chinese. So it's not the Westerners who actually hold the vast majority of this 2.2%. It's mostly the Asians, the Chinese, the Koreans. Vietnamese are increasingly taking up a larger percentage of the foreigners who live in Japan. But the prediction is that the non-Japanese, at the same time that the population of Japan is 70% of what it is today, will be about 10.8%. So that's within the next 50 years. And also the people who are 65 years and older, currently that's about 28.6% of the Japanese population. That's huge. In the year 2070, that number will be 38.7%. So the productivity and the amount of money that needs to be produced by the younger people to support that social welfare is going to be incredibly large. Moving on to the Constitution, in Golden Week, we have Children's Day. Children's Day was Saturday or maybe Friday. And on Wednesday, there are several of these national holidays strung together. On Wednesday was the Constitution Day. That was the launching of the Japanese Constitution. It's a memorial of when the Constitution was launched. It is a national holiday, and it always triggers a reflection on the Constitution and who wrote the Constitution and what about Article 9 and are we going to revise the Constitution? This always comes up. And it came up this week as well, even though a lot of people are on vacation, but it always comes up to revise the Constitution. So there was a pretty significant poll that was taken, a large database and a lot of response, a very high rate of response. Should we revise the Constitution with regard to Article 9? And the response was somewhat startling, maybe, if you want the Japanese to maintain the peace constitution. But 53% of those polled said we should revise Article 9 of the Constitution. 48% no, we should keep it as it is in order to maintain the peace constitution and to prevent, aggressive incursions by China or South Korea, North Korea, or any of the enemies, Russia, in fact, in the Sakhalin Islands, to be more aggressive to Japan because Japan only has defensive capabilities. If they have offensive capabilities, then perhaps they would be seen as a little bit more of a threat. But I think the prime minister has decided that that needs to change. The defense spending is going from 1% of GDP to 2% of GDP. He's been a little bit soft on how we're going to pay for that, although his pronounced policy is the four areas that for the next 5 years will be contributing to supporting that is the corporate taxes, individual taxes, tobacco taxes, and belt tightening for all of the assets that are held by the Japanese government. So that hasn't passed, but it looks like that is the way it's going to go down. The prime minister is holding off on that because I think he wants to keep as pretty and as pristine as possible before elections. Once he finishes the elections, then he can open the kimono a little bit and say, oh, by the way, the numbers are going to come out and you, the Japanese population, are going to be paying 1/4 of the cost for all of these armaments that we're importing and developing internally to protect Japan and to project Japan's strength and capabilities, military capabilities. So there's a lot going on in that area. Going from 1% to 2% is a huge increase, and it will change Japan. Definitely, this will change Japan. So it's a big deal, and I think the prime minister has acknowledged that we need to revise the Constitution. They've already got a constitutional committee that has been meeting weekly on this issue for the last 15 years. So once that that trigger, if 53% is approval, probably of the 48 that are declined are against it. A portion of them are probably sitting on the fence. They just need some external act event to trigger them. So something coming from North Korea or some sort of threat in the South China Seas would probably turn people a little bit more cautious about Japan having the ability to defend itself. And you might remember Japan lost a helicopter in the Okinawan Islands 3 weeks ago. It's taken them 3 weeks. They haven't retrieved all of the bodies. 10 SDF, the Self-Defense Forces personnel, were on that flight. It crashed into the ocean after just a very brief flight. People are very curious about that. It took them almost 2.5 weeks to find the wreckage, and it's just a big, huge news story, and it was caused by an accident. You can't even begin to fathom how much the Japanese population will react if, in fact, a self-defense personnel is actually killed in action. That would just cause a huge firestorm. So that hasn't happened. It hasn't happened. There has been no self-defense forces personnel killed in action since the end of World War II. So if that does happen, I think you would see a huge reaction by the Japanese population. But anyway, congratulations for Constitutional Day, and congratulations for finishing Golden Week. LGBTQ is a legislation that is under consideration now. There has been a lot of effort to pass that before G7. And the reason for that is because the Japanese are laggards with regard to acknowledging same-sex marriage or non-discrimination against or discrimination against people who have different kinds of lifestyles among the G7. In fact, it's not just the G7, but I think of the countries that were polled, Japan ranked 22nd in 1999, and it ranks 34 in current today. And that's of 35 countries that are polled. With regard to same sex, with LGBTQ, what the legislation is and discrimination, that sort of thing, research has indicated that of the 35 countries that have been polled, Japan is dead last. You know, it's at 34. I don't know what country is 35th, but Japan needs to come up to speed on that. Is getting a lot of criticism. You might remember that even the ambassador from the United States to Japan went on on the record to talk about LGBTQ and how he supports it and how Japan needs to accommodate this current lifestyle. But the LDP is really adamantly against it, and I think that they're going to stop it. The prime minister, his secretary, maybe 4 weeks ago, you might remember, he was having a kind of off the record discussion with several newspaper reporters. And he actually said, he's a secretary, the prime minister has 8 secretaries that he hand selects. Some of them come from bureaucracies. Some of them, are handpicked by him. His oldest son is actually his secretary. So 8 of these fellows. One of them was in an interview off the record, designed to be off the record. He said, look, if there was somebody who was LGBTQ living next door to me, I just wouldn't want to live next to them. In fact, I wouldn't even want to talk to them. I wouldn't want. And that was released to the press. So the prime minister got a lot of heat for that. He didn't fire this individual, but it did cause a little bit of consternation among the LGBTQ community. There was a huge parade 2 weeks ago, was it? In Hibiya Cohen, about 20,000 people participated in that. So it's a big deal here. I think the LDP is in a position to stop that. I think probably when G7 happens, they're not going to be able to announce that they have joined everybody else. The prime minister hasn't said it directly, but the voice within the LDP is that, LGBTQ will change Japan. We are focused on the nuclear family, and that is the process and the policy of the Japanese government. We don't want that changed. So I expect that there will be some movement for those of you that are interested in this issue, but I think it will be very, very slow coming. There was a 6.5 magnitude earthquake in Ishikawa. Ishikawa Prefecture faces the Japan Sea. The 311 earthquake was on the Pacific side in Sendai, so a little bit more north. This earthquake on the Japan Sea side, 6.5 is pretty big. It's enough to collapse buildings. Several buildings were collapsed. One person was killed and about 25 were injured. And to put really more pain on that, there was a front that came in that dumped lots of water. It's still raining there. So you really don't want to see an earthquake and then rain right after that, because it causes further land erosion, and the water gets into the fissures and the cracks that were already created. A lot of mud comes in, effluent into the rivers and that sort of thing. So it's a really bad situation for Ishikawa. It's something to continue to watch there. Although Japan has joined the United States in sanctioning Russia, they've come up with even more and harder sanctions to punish Russia for invading Ukraine. Japan is somewhat of a reluctant participant in several areas. One is the Sakhalin-1 and Sakhalin-2 energy conglomerates in Sakhalin producing LNG gas. Japan has continued to be a shareholder and to receive the benefits of those productions. But it's not just there. Also, just in this last year, the amount of seafood imports coming from Russia has exceeded 155 billion yen. That's about 1.2 billion yen in just that 1 year. So this kind of puts a highlight to the dependency Japan has on their food imports. They are not self-sufficient in food. They have imports from all over the world to provide the caloric intake of the 125, just a little bit less than 125 million people who live here, and they do depend on the imports from Russia. So with regard to that, I guess it's going to continue. It will be, let me see, 40% of the seafood is imported from overseas. So Japan produces about 60%. It's not enough for the entire daily intake. But of the countries that are providing that, Chile comes in as number 1. The United States comes in as number 2 importer, and Russia comes in as the 3rd importer. And the highest since 92 was just this last year. So 1.2 billion is really a high water mark for imports from Russia. Typically, they bring in snow crab, and that takes up about 15%, strangely enough. A lot of snow crab comes in to Japan. 15% of the $2 billion is devoted to snow crab. A lot of the other imports are kamaboko, the inputs to kamaboko, which is a big selling product. It's about, let me see, 7.4 billion yen there. Urchin, what is urchin? Uni,
Uni.
uni, yes.
Uni.
Uh, Salmon and trout make up a big percentage of that too. So it's a complicated situation that the prime minister is going into. But let me talk just a little bit about the prime minister. There was a new report just put out by Nikkei that the prime minister is now in the 50% approval rating. So depending on who does the poll, the numbers are different. But in every poll that was taken, one was done by Kyodo, JNN, and Nikkei, 4 percentage points higher than the last one that was done a month ago, 50% approval rating. This is the first time in 8 months that the prime minister has come at that level. So when you're thinking about how he did in the election, what he's going to do with G7, and is he going to call a snap election, these numbers are critically important. Kyoto put him at 46% approval rating, which is up 8.5 from their last one. And JNN puts him at 47 approval rating, which is up 2.9. So no matter who you look at, his numbers are coming up. And the reason they're coming up is because of the elections, and also his stance on being strong with the defense policy and being a little bit more outspoken about diplomacy and what Japan stands for. He's a little bit light on a lot of the details, as is his character. But if you look at where we were a year ago, he was really under the gun because of the Unification Church scandal. The prime minister had been assassinated. This idea of the Unification Church being in bed with a lot of the LDP, particularly with the Abe faction members, became a piece of daily news, revelations coming out every day. And the prime minister was getting really beat up as the Unification Church influence over politics became more and more apparent. A year later, here we are now, he's really begun to reestablish himself. So it looks like, it's his call. Is he going to make the election happen sooner rather than later? Most of the analysts say he needs to call it sooner because Ishin is on a roll. The more time that Ishin has to come up to speed and to get their candidates prepared for a national election, the weaker the LDP is going to be. So most money says that the LDP should close down the House and have an election sooner rather than later. Watch what happens in G7, and then very soon after G7, within 2 months, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen then. Many analysts say this is the best time. He is at his peak since he began his presidency of the LDP and his prime ministership. He is now at the height of his popularity, so anything can happen. And as I said earlier, he's just coming back from a 5-nation tour, 4 of those nations being in Africa. He visits South Korea today, and Monday he'll come back to Japan. And this is the first visit by the prime minister, or by a prime minister, since 2018. And it is hopefully going to initiate this shuttle diplomacy that Japan enjoyed until about maybe 2011. In 2011, there was a meeting with the South Korean president, Lee Myung-bak, and the prime minister at that time, Prime Minister Noda, in Kyoto. And then after that, the prime minister changed, and the relationships between Korea and Japan just became much more acrimonious. And so it's up to President Yoon to kind of soften that up and to build this relationship. And it seems like the prime minister is on board with that. He's invited Yoon to come to G7 too. They will meet once again in Hiroshima on the sidelines. That is scheduled. At the same time, Toshimitsu Motegi, who is the Secretary General of the LDP, is in Washington, D.C. He's been there for about 5 days, meeting with the Secretary Blinken and let me see, Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman and Bob Menendez. And a lot of the things that they're talking about there, he's got a different job than the prime minister, obviously, but they're still talking about how to include the African nations, the South American nations who have been influenced, and also the Pacific nations who have been influenced by China in infrastructure projects, in airports, and a lot of money being made available to them. And although they're coming in late, the United States, Japan, many of the other like-minded countries need to bring these guys back into the fold. There was a meeting in Saudi Arabia just this last week where the Saudis are now really cozying up to China. And this is a worrisome development for the United States and for many of these like-minded countries. Who would have thought 2 years ago that Saudi Arabia would have been in a position to have this cozy relationship with China? But it is causing a lot of concern in the nation, in America's nation capital, and that's what Motegi is there to talk about. There was also a visit by a South Korean opposition lawmaker to Takeshima, which is an island, an uninhabited island that is claimed by Korea. It is claimed by Japan. They have certain agreements where they're not going to be moving aggressively on that. They're not going to be stationing people there, living there. But the visit by a South Korean opposition party just inflames things. There's, even President Yoon, who is not very popular. He's somewhat popular, but even when he became president, it was only by the skin of his teeth. So there's a strong opposition to South Korea becoming more friendly with Japan. There's still a lot of resentment that still exists there. So he's got to dance a very fine line. And for an opposition party to visit Takeshima is very unpolitic. So it actually became a topic of conversation when Secretary General Motegi was in Washington, D.C. And I think, Maya, that about closes it up for the important things that I wanted to talk about today. So it is Golden Week, so it is somewhat light in terms of politics that's going on inside the Diet. The Diet has been out of session. Also, there's been little movement within the political factions that make up the LDP. But I think once we come back to work tomorrow, it will be very active. We've got 12 days until G7. It'll be very active, but I don't think there'll be a lot of political shenanigans. Once G7 is behind us, the door is open, and I think we can expect a lot of action.
Right. We're going to talk about that as soon as things start happening then. Well, thank you very much, Timothy. Let's move to Clubhouse then and continue there with the questions and answers. We have, quite a few people there waiting for you to join. So
thank you. I'm sorry. It looks like I went a little bit long today. Even though there wasn't a lot happening politically inside Nagatacho, there's always something going on, and I hope this briefing gives you a little bit of insight to what's going on. And by the way, before we close up, what happens in politics, not just in Japan, but everywhere, politics moves very, very slowly. And the reason why I give you this briefing every week is because things that we talked about maybe 2 months ago finally reach fruition, today or in the next week. And when you're following that, you can see what's happening. You can see how it developed. So it's usually broad stuff, not minute stuff, not threading the needle. It is larger stuff, but it predicts what's going to happen in the very near term. So I appreciate people being interested enough to follow this briefing and to be, clued in and participate in the Q&A session as well. Thanks, Maya.
And thank you for the analysis and for connecting the dots. It's really important. It gives a lot of new perspectives also to me and puts things in perspective, which is very important as well. Okay, so that's... Thank you. That's all for today on the live stream. So we'll continue with the questions and answers in Clubhouse. Let's move there and, continue.
See you there. Thanks, Maya. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Timothy. Well, if you found this session informative and helpful, please subscribe to our channel. Also, please tell your friends or colleagues if they need information about what is going on in the public sphere in Japan. We're here every Sunday morning, actually 8:20 Japan time, You can join us next time or watch the live streams later on YouTube. The questions and answers, the live sessions are available only in Clubhouse. So if you find us there, you're free to join there as well. Thank you very much again. Have a great day. That's all.